Before we get into the next presentation, I neglected to get our minutes approved from our last two board meetings from the end of July and the 1st of August. So can you just do one motion to approve them both then?
Second.
Ashley, we have a second?
I second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So moved. Thank you. Sorry about neglecting that earlier today. Yes, for both meetings. Thank you. All right, we're going to jump back into water again with the update on water initiatives. Eric Ekdahl with the State Water Resources Control Board, and Camillar, come on up. California Water Resources.
So yes, please.
Gudavechi, how's that?
And I think sure. And then it's the right arrow key. Okay.
Make sure everyone, can hear myself. So hopefully I'm loud enough, and if not, please give a yell. Thank you for having me today. My name is Eric Ekdahl. I'm the Deputy Director for the Division of Water Rights at the State Water Resources Control Board. And I wanted to provide a brief update on some recent activity we're undertaking at the board to streamline underground storage water rights permitting. This is an effort that's really kick-started. It's been going on for a while. We've had some internal discussions extending all the way back actually to 2015 when we were at the peak of the drought, and the governor issued the executive order kind of asking us to look at streamlining the temporary urgency permit changes. We met with a core group of us, and we started kind of highlighting, well, what are ways that we can make this work more quickly in general. Kind of dipped down a little bit activity during 2017 when we had that tremendous water year, but in the last year or so it's picked up again, really driven by a stakeholder group coming out of ACWA, Association of California Water Agencies, but not only ACWA, there's others as well. Starting about 9 months ago, maybe 10 months ago, there was a series of kind of internal brainstorming sessions where some attorneys and our attorneys and us got together and said, what could we do? And about 9 months later, here we are, and I'll describe kind of where we are in terms of our thinking, some potential outcomes, and where we'd like to go over the next 6 months or so. And as I go through, please feel free to interrupt with questions as you have them. And I'll briefly describe the need and the approach. We're all aware of SGMA. SGMA's coming down quickly now. We're past the period where we're going to be putting together our sustainability agencies, and now we're actually getting into the really hard part and putting together the sustainability plans. Those plans are going to describe how groundwater can essentially be used and allocated in some circumstances throughout much of the state's agricultural heartland. On top of that, there's a changing climate. It's going to get hotter, it's going to get drier, and that's going to put even greater reliance on our groundwater resources to be used as a true bank so that when we have really wet years like 2017, we can put as much in the ground as we possibly can. But in those longer, hotter droughts, we can tap the groundwater resource to make sure that we have enough water in our surface water for municipal needs, for agricultural needs, for environmental needs. Along with that changing climate, there will be a changing hydrology. We've relied on our snowpack as this kind of like slow discharge from the mountains for a long, long time, and that's going to change. It will become flashier. We may still have just as much water, but it may come in shorter bursts, and it may come kind of in a shorter season. The other thing that we were trying to do is to do this through an administrative approach. What does that mean? It means that this does not rely on a change to code, and it does not rely on a change to regulations. Anytime you open up the water code, particularly where water rights are involved, it becomes very contentious very quickly, and the likelihood of actually moving something forward is significantly reduced on a short time scale. So we looked at what we thought we could do really within our own house to streamline our water availability analysis and some of our initial assumptions, but leaving in place all the protections that the water code already puts in place for public protest, public notification. Those all stay the same. And so with that, we focused on a concept of how we can divert high flow events and permit those diversions more quickly. Really what we're looking at here are those huge flow events like we saw in 2017, times when we can feel confident or we can feel like there's less risk involved in permitting something more quickly, when there's less risk of affecting downstream water right users, where there's less risk of affecting in-stream flow, ecological or environmental needs. We were focusing on diversions by local public agencies as defined by SGMA. So we're here talking about kind of water districts or GSAs, groups or large public entities that can move these projects forward. And we're doing that because under SGMA, the local public agencies would be responsible for their own CEQA document. If an individual comes to us, they can still use a lot of these principles that I'll talk about, but we're responsible for a CEQA document, and that just inherently adds time. We're looking at diversions that exceed the 90th percentile daily flow level. That means that we're looking at, and I'll show a graph of this in a minute to kind of give a better pictorial example of what we mean, but flow events that are above 90% of the flows at that spot over the entire length of record for that water gauge. Essentially, that confines it to really high flow events.
How often does that happen?
Well, so 90% of the time. That is by definition what it means. So if you had 100 years of record, it would mean that for 90 of those years, only the top 10 flow events over that 100-year record, you'd have to be in that range to be able to divert. And that actually leaves a fair amount of water on the table. And I'll show again some pictures in a second. We'd further confine the diversions to between December 1st and March 31st. That again is really focusing on the period where historically we have a lot of water in our systems. It also then minimizes the issues that we might see later, such as in June or July, where the flow is starting to come down, and 90th percentile of a flow in July or August might only be a couple cubic feet per second, whereas 90th percentile in January might be a couple thousand cubic feet per second. So there's this time kind of scale that helps constrain these to a really truly high flow event. We want to protect environmentally important channel forming flows, and so on top of the 90th percentile limitation, we'd cap those diversions to 10 to 20% of the available flow. This comes from a report basically that says, and I can provide the reference if people are interested in the report, but it looks at the importance of kind of these high strength flushing flows to stream morphology, to forming gravel bars for salmon or for other aquatic species. And so we're trying to preserve some of that functionality to those high strength events. I want to emphasize that what we're describing is not a requirement. So there's been some confusion when we describe this. This is really, when we kind of describe this to others, we describe it as a streamlined water availability analysis. You're not required to do this. If you want to come in for a diversion on May 2nd, that's not confined between this December 1st and March 31st event, that looks at a different flow metric and for different flow criteria, you are still able to do that. Nothing is stopping you from doing that. This is not a requirement. But what we're saying is that if you come in with an application that meets this checklist, we think we're able to move that more quickly because we've already satisfied some of our initial concerns regarding how much water there is available and what it will do to downstream users. So again, these are guidelines. Applicants can provide additional or different data, and it may still qualify for a streamlined process. So here's an example of what that would get you. This is for Deer Creek. Deer Creek is a small, undammed tributary to the Sacramento River up around Chico. You can see there's three colors to this graph. The gray is the USGS 90th percentile flow criteria. So that's kind of the bypass flow, if you want to think of it that way. If you're not above that level, you can't divert. Furthermore, it's confined to just December 1st through March 31st, so if you're not within that window, you also can't divert. The blue shows what the flow was at a gauge on Deer Creek from 1994 through 1999. And you can see it goes up, and it's pretty variable and spiky during the winter, and it comes down during the summer. The orange shows how much water would be available for diversion at this gauge through the 5 years or so of this record. And you can see that the big high flow events, you're able to take, I'm looking at a couple of them, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 cubic feet per second. When you run the math out on that, that's about a couple thousand acre feet in just a couple day period. So there's a lot of water in just this one small tributary. During droughts, there's less water to divert under this criteria, but that's what you would expect, right? These flows, or this criteria, is specifically targeting wet periods or these big flow years where we have a lot of water available. During droughts, when there's just inherently less water, under this criteria, there'd be less water to divert. Although even still, I think in the 5 years here, there's still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so events where you still could take a little bit of water. We ran some basic calculations, just potential volumes in acre feet. Looked at a couple of different water years. I want to emphasize that we just looked here at the 90th percentile flow criteria, and we didn't include any of the other analyses that we'd require, and that I'll show in a couple slides, that include analysis of downstream water right holders, existing regulatory requirements, or protection of in-stream environmental uses. But what it shows is that in some stream systems, maybe in the Sacramento, there's some water available almost every year. And that's kind of what you would expect in the Sacramento system. The hydrology is a little bit different. It's more rain dominated, so you get these storm events, you get peak flows that kind of push through these undammed systems pretty quickly. But we also looked at the Tuolumne, and what the Tuolumne shows is that there is still a tremendous amount of water that is potentially available. I don't want to say that it is 100% available, we still have to go through the rest of the analysis, but wet years like 1997 or 2017, over 300,000 acre feet potentially available. Other considerations. The applicant must demonstrate that the diversion won't harm downstream users. That's a tough one. I'll be upfront in saying that that's kind of one of the stumbling blocks for a lot of our applications that come in. But we think that it can be done in a simplified and more streamlined way by looking at existing water right holders in our ERIMS, Electronic Water Rights Management System, which lists all of the downstream water right holders already. We'd also require a gauge installation at the point of diversion or very close nearby. And that's to help build the record of what truly is the 90th percentile flow, and that can be beneficial in two ways. One, it can help protect in-stream uses, but it may also be available to show then maybe the 90th percentile is too conservative. Maybe it should be the 85th percentile. Maybe it should be the 80th percentile. We can't really get there yet without building on that data. But to help incentivize gauge installation, we're considering discounted fees. So right now, the application fee for a large water right can get pretty expensive, easily into the hundreds of thousands of dollars for some of these big water rights. But again, you're talking about 30, 40, 50,000 acre feet potentially per year. A gauge may cost $20,000 to install, and what we're contemplating, and we may propose to our board, is to directly discount the cost of a gauge installation from that application fee. So if you paid $20,000 for a gauge installation, you just lop that off from your initial application fee.
How do you find a gauge that looks at the river and it's not a pipeline, but it's a river, so that it spreads as it goes, so gauge in the river is not necessarily failure.
We would look towards USGS, who has a lot of methodology and a lot of experience in kind of how you set these things up. Department of Water Resources as well. There's a lot of gauge methodology out there that we'd rely on. The board wouldn't develop that on its own. Accounting. This has been a stumbling block for some of our past applications. How do you account for the water that gets put into the basin? And I use the term LIFO up there. That's to stand for last in, first out. In some circumstances we've looked at, each well you have to tell us exactly how deep it is and how much water is getting pumped out. We actually think for the purposes of Sigma, where these applications are going to come in through a large GSA that may cover most or all of a basin, that you can look at that GSA scale and say, all right, I know I'm putting in 100,000 acre feet of water. I'm doing my water budget for Sigma anyway. I can rely on that and show that we've used all that water. It was the last to go in. It was the first that we pumped out. And we can figure out that kind of it works at that basin scale. We can also look at what's in the GSP or groundwater sustainability plan. We can look at adjudications. Some adjudications set out how you can manage your water budget. There could be other approaches. We're very open to how you can account for this water in an easy but realistic and scientifically accurate way. Caveats and conditions. There's always caveats and conditions. This is not a guarantee. Just because you come in with all of this, it doesn't mean that we're going to say, yes, here's your water right. Water rights will never be as easy, unfortunately, as I was going to use the analogy of going to the DMV, but maybe that's not the analogy I want to use right now. It's still going to take some time. It's still going to be a little bit complicated. We still have to do the scientific analysis, and in some circumstances, it may not be enough. Initially, we may go back and ask you for more. All requirements for CEQA, public notification, and public protest still apply. We don't change any of these. And so again, if we look at our permitting backlog, and right now the division does have a significant permitting backlog, many of the backlogs are caused because the applicant hasn't completed CEQA, or it's in a public protest that's still being resolved, sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8 years later. So if you do your homework up front, you'll greatly minimize the slowdown.
So I've learned way too much about CEQA. So we're trying to capture something in a very timely basis, but we're not always going to know ahead of time that it's there. There is no way to speed up CEQA unless
So-
you get no harm, but it's CEQA.
One of the things that we're working, and this is unrelated to this, but we called it a bridge, was the bill that was in AB 2649, the Arambula bill, which would have authorized a 5-year temporary permit.
Yes.
And the 180-day emergency permit, kind of using those 3 mechanisms to bridge to this longer permanent water right, where you could come in with the 180-day, which is CEQA exempt to some degree. The 5-year was not completely CEQA exempt, but I think you could start it. I'd have to go back and look exactly, don't quote me. CEQA didn't have to be finished, maybe.
Right.
And then this, where CEQA would have to be finished. So it would give you the opportunity, if those wet years did come along, to use some of the emergency or temporary processes then to leverage into this permanent application.
Because there's no way you can do a programmatic EIR for something like this. Yeah.
You may be able to do a programmatic, again, at the GSA scale. And that's kind of what we're hoping. We already do things that are like that in water rights, where you have a water district that has multiple points of diversion. And we kind of think of this as the same way. Maybe you have multiple points of diversion managed by the GSA. It goes onto different fields or into different recharge basins, but it's all permitted under one permit. And we've done that before, and we can envision doing that again for these types of projects. We would like to reserve jurisdiction. So what does that mean? Well, if we move these forward more quickly and we kind of look at this 90th percentile metric, we're taking on a bit of risk without doing maybe the full deep dive modeling analysis that we might do for other types of water rights. So we'd like to reserve jurisdiction that if we do find evidence that we need to change how much can be diverted, we can open the permit back up through the normal hearing process, just like any other water right. We already have that authority anyway, but we want to be explicit about it in these types of permits. Alternatively, I kind of gave you the worst case scenario where we ratchet down on things, but at the same time, it could work in reverse. Maybe you're able to show, look, I've done 3 years worth of study here. I can show that at 90th percentile, at 10,000 CFS, we're pretty good. We're flooding downstream, and maybe we can reduce this a little bit. So it could go both ways.
So if you want to reserve that jurisdiction, you're implying that there's some sort of monitoring, or, I mean, how are you going to tell what the impacts are, and who pays for that?
I'll come to that in a second. Other caveats and conditions, all our regular kind of requirements would be in place, term 91, term 93, salinity requirements, should account for loss in the basin. So that this gets to your question about accounting. We do assume, like a lot of other reports, that there would be a report that's submitted to the board, and under any post-14 appropriative right, you are required to submit monthly updates of how much water you diverted. With our new monitoring and reporting regulations that went into effect a couple of years ago, our SB 88 regulations, you should have a metering device on your diversion. So we anticipate building this data over time in terms of how the impacts to the environment are monitored. I think that'd be on a permit by permit basis, and it would depend in part on what types of protests we got and what kind of comments we got on the notification of the application itself. So there's the last bullet for reporting. Next steps. We're seeking input from stakeholders now. We've talked to a number of state agencies. We've talked to a couple of NGOs. We're still looking to hear from Aqua. We'll hopefully hear from NACWA later this week and a couple of others. And we're still seeking input, hopefully through the end of September, maybe the early part of October. From there, we want to draft a guidance document. And we have to be really careful not to create underground regulations. That's why I kept saying over and over, this is just a guidance. This is not a requirement. You're still able to come in under any other kind of application or with any other data that you want. But we want to develop a guidance document and then get that out, hopefully, first part of the year. It depends a little bit on how much feedback we get from others over the next month or so. We'd post that guidance on our website and begin implementation from there. If you have questions or comments, you can shoot me an email, ask them here. I'd be more than happy to reach out or meet with others as needed.
So I'm pretty confused about this. How long is it between the time there are high flows, someone applies for a diversion, and the water is diverted?
Under a typical water right, it can be anywhere from 2 years to 20 years. And it depends entirely on a couple of things. One, it depends if CEQA has been completed. There's a project, and I'm not going to name it specifically, but they like to hammer us on this, and it just drives me nuts a little bit. They applied in 1997, okay? But we, by statute, cannot act until CEQA is completed. They haven't completed CEQA. We can't move forward. Yet every public meeting, they still bring up, well, we applied in 1997 and you still haven't moved on it. It's because your priority is based on when your application is accepted. So if we accept your application in 1997, you get your priority, even though it might be another 20 or 30 years before your permit is fully completed, you get your 1997 priority date. And that's built into statute, and that's not driven by us.
How does that correspond to the actual water?
So they can't divert until their application is processed and accepted and completed. So even though they've applied in 1997, they haven't been able to divert or store any water for that project, but they're in the queue. So if you move quickly, and this is entirely on the applicant, if you complete CEQA, if you resolve your public protests, we can move within a year to a year and a half. It's entirely possible to move these things actually pretty quickly. And then from then on, you'd be able to start your diversion.
Okay, just one last question. Does it have anything to do with the actual amount of water?
So yes, and well, yes. So one of the things I talked about, a discounted fee. One of the things that people have raised for our attention is how water rights fees are calculated. Right now, it's based on what's called the face value of your application or the face value of your permit. This is when you first come in, you say, I think I'm going to take a maximum of 1,000 acre-feet. Well, then you're paying a fee based on 1,000 acre-feet. The problem in doing that with trying to capture these high flow events is that I showed that one slide for Deer Creek where there might not be any water available for 5 years. You're potentially asking for a lot of water, 50,000 acre-feet. That fee is going to be pretty substantial. So how can we look at making this equitable? And there still would be a fee each year. There's still database costs and it's just administrative costs and things that we need to do to manage the permit. But can we look at actually looking at the volume of water that was actually diverted and assessing a fee based on that? So it would be kind of a retroactive fee based on how much water you diverted the year before. Does that answer your question? Yes. Yep, so we have emergency authority for our fee regulations. We adopt them every year, typically in September. There's a stakeholder process we go through, multiple stakeholder meetings, and Then we take it before the board in a public meeting. I think our next one actually will be September 20th, where we'll revise the fees for the next year.
So my question is, compared to a regular permit, a streamlined one takes how long?
That's entirely up to the applicant.
I mean, okay, so CEQA, so how long is CEQA going to take?
Let's imagine that everything goes very well. Let's imagine that CEQA is done when the application comes in, and let's imagine that the applicant has talked to CDFW and maybe some of the others that might have concerns in the watershed before the diversion starts. Usually there's a month or two when we look at the application itself to make sure that we've gotten all the information that we need, that we think we can use to go forward. It would go under staff review, and then again, if everything was lined up and it could move quickly, I'd anticipate 6 months to a year, which for water rights is extremely fast.
And after the 5 year of the permit, do you have to resubmit and?
Nope, so this would be
no,
a permanent application, a permanent permit. There would be a time period under which you'd prove up your claim, and then you'd move the license 15 or 20 years down the road. We anticipate that people might ask for longer periods of time on their permit because you might only get these flashy discharges once every 10 years. So maybe the length of time is 30 years instead of 15, but that's something to be kind of negotiated with each of the applicants.
Right, and the cost of the infrastructure, you want to capture large quantities, so you want to oversize.
Right.
Even though you're not using it very often. Interesting. All right. Thank you.
I like that term, Eric, flashy discharge. That's is that one that you came up with? That's well done on that. I was wondering if this streamlined process could also be called a simplified process.
Yes.
Similar type of, very, very good.
Yep.
Governor Brown had an executive order a few years ago for groundwater recharge. Could this also be done through an executive order that would simplify the process, or that executive order process, does it have to go through the same steps that
So we do
described?
have in place right now, we call it the temporary urgency change petition approach, where it was driven from the executive order on groundwater recharge back in 2015, I believe. And that process does waive a number of requirements that we would normally examine as part of the application process. I don't think we want to waive those permanently. There are some CEQA exemptions and there are some notification exemptions. For example, under the TUCP process, or the urgency permit process, it's not true TUCP, but under this executive order process, we can issue the permit and then receive protest on it after we've already issued the permit. And I don't think we want to take that same approach here. So there are some things in the regular application pathway that we want to preserve, including public notification, including CEQA. But in terms of the 90th percentile approach, if it was worded very carefully, potentially that could be done through an executive order. I wouldn't say, no, we couldn't do this. It's up to the executive to decide what he or she wants to do.
water rights not being developed through an executive order? That's more of a project, kind of has a beginning and an end to it. You're talking about a process that develops a right to the flashy discharge.
Correct.
Good.
Yep.
I think it's great that, in California, it really shouldn't be optional when we have these opportunities. Do you expect there'll be a time where there'll be so many requests for that there'll be many more water rights, and you'll have to go through a check off of who's going to be
Yes.
given that, depending on the size or magnitude of the flashy discharge?
I do. So we can look at, kind of 2011 and 2017 as example years. And there are estimates, and I'm not sure how accurate they are, that in 2017, which was a record precipitation year, somewhere between 40 and 50 million acre-feet of water went out through the delta. And, you hear the sound bites, oh, that's, wasting water. Well, it's not wasting water. There was no way we could capture or store that water, right? All the dams were discharging. They were in flood control operations. There's nowhere to storage. We didn't have the infrastructure in place to put a lot of this water on the ground or underground. You can imagine a scenario in the future, maybe not 50 million acre-feet worth, but in a kind of a wetter year where you have a couple 10, 15, 20 million acre-feet of water that's freely available, where as much of that as possible, people have asked for that right and have kind of locked it up. We've already seen that happen in the southern San Joaquin. So the Kern River, the Kings River right now, we have applications at the board for every last drop of water, whether it's the 90th, the 99th, whether it's December 1st or July 1st, every drop of water is accounted for in those basins. And people argue about the things that might come once every 20 or 30 years. That's how valuable that water is. You can look forward and anticipate that with climate change, with kind of the changing hydrology, increased population, the similar things would happen in the San Joaquin or the Sacramento Valley itself. It might take 30 or 40 or 50 years, but you can kind of see that progression heading.
Will it be first in time?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I guess the proof is going to be in the pudding. I'm pretty skeptical. I've heard a number of NGOs say that the high flows are extremely important, and if you take any drop of water off of high flows, then the riparian trauma, or whatever you want to, I don't know what the correct word is, but there's a certain expectation of a change in that habitat as a result of these high flows. And so I just remember back when Glenn Clusa was working on a winter water right, and these same issues came up by NGOs, and I think many of those people still believe the same thing. So I was glad to hear a regulator say that there's less risk pumping at high flows, because that's not what we typically hear. But even at those high flows, and if you're looking at only pumping above 90%, unless you have a certain amount of capacity as a district or a grower, you're not going to realize enough of that water, and to anticipate and spend all this extra money to use it once in a while is probably not going to happen either. So I applaud you, but it's probably going to have to drop down to some number below 90, where people can sustain some pumping for a while, and you're probably going to have to do some convincing of some of the other agencies like Fish and Wildlife that this may not be a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really important comment. That part of my mission here today would be to manage expectations, and the idea again that you just come up. I partially succeeded at that. That all the issues that you raised, I think, are going to be really difficult, and we're going to have to work through them, particularly the first that come in. We are going to get public protests. Right now, we get public protests on every single water right that comes in, and it can take decades to resolve. Part of that is on the applicant, right? They can do some of that upfront work, and we found that even just a little bit of consultation with CDFW goes a long, long way. And a lot of times you can work those out before you even get there. It's not going to account for every NGO, but we have to be able to work with kind of what we have.
Can I ask one more question? This is one type of project, taking water off of high flows. With Prop 1 now you have reservoirs coming on, and their diversions are going to have probably different scenarios than what you have here, which creates potential conflict for you all. So have you thought much about how you're going to, if it's first in time, then I guess it's when you're in line, but some of these reservoirs are in the offing, they're out there. And whereas, so have you dealt with that issue at all?
So, yes and no. It kind of, in concept, did I just turn that off? No. In concept, we've accounted for it with, the 10 to 20% kind of cap. And we envision that as being at kind of the watershed or sub-watershed scale. And we still need to do a little bit of work on our part to figuring out, well, what does that mean? We look at Deer Creek. Are we talking about just Deer Creek? Is that the watershed scale? Or are we talking about Deer Creek and then there's little tributaries to Deer Creek? Well, do we mean those and each one of those get 20%? We kind of envision this at, the Deer Creek scale. So if you start kind of ramping that up, you can roughly pencil out what that would mean in terms of some of the new reservoirs and stuff that are planned in the Sacramento Valley. But at the same time, those reservoirs are going to be very complex permitting processes. It's not like 600 acre-feet during a kind of wet winter in Deer Creek. It's for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of acre-feet, potentially using state filings that go back to the 70s, with a host of endangered species issues wrapped on top of it. It's a hearing process. If you kind of use your crystal ball, it's a hearing process that maybe rivals WaterFix in scale. We don't know. We haven't seen anything. We haven't actually gotten the application, but it's going to be a task for the board. We haven't done something like that since really the State Water Project. So it will be a challenge. I don't want to leave on a pessimistic note. We're up for that challenge, right?
No, I do have a question because I think a Caballero bill passed on Friday night, AB 747, which is the Office of Administrative
Yes.
Hearing. And that's going to be in the water rights area of the State Water Board. Will that have any role in this as another internal mechanism to have dedicated staff just doing these things? Or is that just for people who are doing appeals and protests?
It will help. At least it's anticipated to help. So,
Well, let's assume it gets signed, yeah.
right, assume it gets signed. The bill 747 creates an Office of Administrative Hearings in the State Water Board. It's really stemmed off of AB 313 Gray from last year, which was vetoed by the governor, which would have assigned administrative law judges. Our concern at that time was that to get water ALJs, we weren't sure if we could do that, and kind of the staffing expertise that would need to go along with it. There were some comments offered, and then this was kind of, there was trailer bill language proposed earlier this year. The funding mechanism wasn't worked out in that trailer bill. It didn't go forward there, and it was resurrected in 747 late last week or a couple weeks ago. It would create an office. It would report directly to either the executive director or the chair of the board itself. As written, there's no funding mechanism for it. At least that I wasn't aware of one. I haven't gone back and looked. So until there is money for it, it actually would hinder things because it then takes away a bunch of authority. We wouldn't be able to process revocations, failure to files, a bunch of other kind of more bread and butter type enforcement actions. Those would all be routed to the office under the proposed or pending legislation. So we'll see. If it does get signed, if there's funding, then those staff could be potentially available to help on hearings if they didn't have other pending workload.
Yeah, just to close, I want to thank Eric and his colleagues at the Water Board for, this may not be perfect, it may not sound perfect, but it's a really important start, and we're going to sort of see how it works. And just, I know you have been thinking about it for a while, but I want to remind the board, this was something that the State Board came to the workshop we did last November, already quite a ways down the way, and they've really kept at it. And then also, I think it's going to be different depending on where you are in the state, right? So it's going to be a lot harder to do this on the Tuolumne than it is going to be to do it on the Kern. So I think take that into account as well.
No, I agree with you. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
Camille?
President Cameron, board members, board staff, Secretary Ross. wanted to thank you. My name is Kamyar Gavechi, Department of Water Resources. I manage statewide integrated water management. I've been with DWR for 40 calendar years, started at the town of Hood as a student assistant, then to be the intake to the peripheral canal, and I guess still a proposed intake to the water fix. I appreciate this opportunity to share with you work that we've been doing on what we call flood managed aquifer recharge, or FloodMAR. We did bring for you a couple of handouts, what we're calling the white paper. It's actually green cover, and then the draft research and data development framework, and I'll touch on that as I go along. Also wanted to thank Don and Ashley for participating in the FloodMAR workshop last week and presenting. Ashley presented your recommendations to the administration on managed aquifer recharge, and it was, they're very well received. Thank you. So kind of building on Eric's comments, California is really, water is about a tale of two extremes. Now, as a Mediterranean climate, in and of itself, that's not unusual. Yet, we, with climate change, are experiencing flashier winter flows and less flows in the summer, and we anticipate that to be exacerbated in the future, and I'll show that in the next slide. The timelines that you see on this slide show that we have had a lot of flood events along the top of the timeline, a number of long drought events, and in some years we can actually have both. So this plot is an illustration of potential climate change impacts on our hydrology. This is just one major river in California showing a climate change simulation from 1980 through 2100. The blue grayish lines are all the first 30 years of that sequence, 1980 to 2010. The more amber colored lines are the last 30 years of that sequence, 2070 to 2100. And the darker bands are the medians of all the variations in those 30-year periods. And this shows very distinctly and conspicuously that our winter flows are going to be higher in the future, and that the summer flows are going to be lower. And on top of that, our snowpack, which is our largest surface reservoir today, it could be as low as 40% of what it is now, based on estimates from Scripps Institute. California's water infrastructure has been developed around that snowpack hydrology. And so what this graphic says, at least to me, is we have to really rethink, replumb, and remanage California water as we go in the future, or we're going to be in a world of hurt. And to me, certainly the groundwater part in the summer is important, but in my comments today, what I'd like to continue to reinforce that this is as much a flood risk issue as it is a water supply issue, and that the opportunity that FloodMAR provides us is to be able to manage the system in a way that provides us multiple benefits, including both terrestrial and fisheries benefits. On top of that, we also have to keep in mind there are some systemic root challenges that make managing water difficult in California. And some of the conversation you had with Eric, I think, illustrates that. We're a very decentralized water management system. About 2,400 entities make decisions about water throughout the state, and they do not have good coordinated communication. It's improving, but not where it needs to be. We also, our regulations are set up in silos. So we have different agencies mandated to set regulations for their resources, and they were not developed in a integrated systematic or system-wide approach, so it's not unusual and surprising that for a project proponent to implement a project, it's very time-consuming and costly, and at times almost impossible to meet all of the requirements because they were not set up that way. Another is that given a lot of the conversation is, well, we don't know. We need more information. So we need to have a better data-driven decision-making process in California than what we do today. And we have to really make a compelling argument to the public that we need to invest smartly to be able to overcome these root challenges and prepare for the future. So during the Brown administration, a number of initiatives have worked to move us toward a more sustainable water management approach. The Governor's Water Action Plan, which I know you're very familiar with, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is transformational. It took us 100 years to add groundwater management back into the water cycle from a state policy perspective. Had it not been for SGMA, I would not be standing here talking about FloodMAR. And that's why it was off the table. And so SGMA has been a really important driver of allowing us to rethink these new opportunities. The 2017 update of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan includes in its portfolio of actions FloodMAR type projects. And so it's not just about hardscape, it is seen as part and parcel of what we need to do moving forward. So again, groundwater, flood management, ecosystem management, we have to co-manage the system to get us to where we need to go. This flower diagram, the petals are the various sectors of the water management system. And historically, and even today, we tend to operate on the periphery of those petals. And once in a while, we'll do things where the petals overlap, we get some multiple benefits. Going forward, from now on, we have to operate in that center circle where we get maximum overlap, maximum multiple benefits from each and every dollar that we invest in our water management system. And what that's going to require is much more multi-sector collaboration and co-management. We have to bring multiple disciplines together as we plan our way forward. And we have to plan, design, and implement multi-benefit projects. And the neat opportunity here is each of these sectors have their own pots of money that we have to knit together to actually implement these multi-benefit projects. So FloodMAR is just about using high flow events for the purpose of recharging our very degraded aquifers. And in this context, we're thinking about that recharge occurring on agricultural and working lands. Now, stormwater management is very similar in concept, yet it has been historically more of an urban setting, and that's important and has to be done. FloodMAR is thinking about the agricultural and working lands where actually infiltration capacity is much better. So FloodMAR is characterized by taking an integrated approach. In fact, you'd have to go out of your way and not to have an integrated FloodMAR project by definition. It also has to be a voluntary program. The Corps of Engineers, when they did their Central Valley comprehensive flood study back in the late 90s and early 20s, they actually looked at this concept. The Hydrologic Engineering Center has published a report back in 2002, Consumptive Use for Flood Protection. And in concept, they identified, or at least analyzed, close to 1 million acre-feet in the Central Valley, Sac and San Joaquin, that would be available just by reoperating the existing rule curves and putting that water into the ground. Where they got into trouble is their implementation strategy was, we'll go and buy people's land and we'll recharge the ground. Well, that didn't go very far. So in my mind, for Floodmar to be successful, it has to be a public-private partnership. The landowners own an asset, the infiltration capacity and characteristics that the public can use and compensate them for. And that's going to be an important part of making this work, is coming up with that easement compensation plan, so that farmers can do the math. They can say, you know, how much of my land could I actually put into recharge if I get compensated and make ends meet? The other neat thing about Floodmar, it's multi-sector, as I've mentioned. I won't belabor that point. It's scalable. I take every opportunity to say Don Cameron is the godfather of Floodmar because he's been doing it on his farm for many years, decades. And the neat thing about Floodmar is it can occur on the farm scale, the GSA scale, a groundwater basin scale, regionally, and in the entire watershed. And they can be done concurrently. You don't have to wait till all of them are ready to go. And as you go in larger scale, it does take more coordination. It'll cost some more, and it's going to require us to work on more of those challenges, those root cause challenges, breaking the boundaries between our institutions. It's multifaceted. There's no one aspect of Floodmar. It includes reoperation, conveyance, storage, a number of things. I have a slide that will illustrate that better. And it's an untapped part of our water portfolio. We built those levees to keep the water in the river and out of the lands. We now have to find a way to re-engineer that and get those high peak flows back on the valley floor the way the water cycle in nature managed it. So the state of California actually has begun recommending Floodmar. I mentioned the 2017 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, the system reoperation study that DWR has been working on, the Phase 3 report that came out a year ago actually identified Floodmar as the next logical place for the system reoperation study to go, and we're already spending some of the remaining funds of that on our work, and you'll see that. The State Board of Food and Ag, you put out your great forum, or convened your great forum almost a year ago, and you put out your a dozen recommendations, a number of which are already being implemented. In fact, I think at least 2 of them are covered by the work that Eric shared with you earlier. And the California Water Plan 2018 update will be coming out with the public review draft in the next few weeks. And it includes Floodmar and this multi-benefit approach as one of the strategies of going forward. So I mentioned that it's multifaceted. So Floodmar, again, as you think of watershed and regional basis, includes what's called forecast-informed reservoir operation by changing the rule curves and releasing water from the reservoir in advance of the next flood and banking that in the ground. It includes using the reservoir recharge pool. It includes expanded outlets. So if we want to really take advantage of getting more water, evacuating more water quickly out of the reservoirs, we're going to need different gate structures, like the ones they retrofitted at Folsom. And we're going to have to reevaluate those throughout California reservoirs. Expanded conveyance. So as we want to upscale or scale up a Floodmar, we're going to need better conveyance. And what a neat concept of having the flood community help cost share on major conveyance into the center of the valley so more farmers can get access to high flows. Expanded in new flood bypasses and floodplains. This will also provide new floodplain habitat and water and wetland areas. Suitable recharge on ag lands, figuring out what all those parameters are, compensating landowners for being part of a Floodmar program, and then identifying what are those various recharge methods that can fit into the program, and then the ecosystem enhancements, both aquatic and terrestrial. So in the white paper, we identify many public benefits. There are private and public benefits from flood-mar. This is a list of the public benefits, and the ones with stars next to them are the ones that the Prop 1 storage program, grant program, said are eligible for getting public funding. Now you'll notice there's no star next to aquifer replenishment. And I think that's because this was crafted before SGMA. And so what we have to do as a state, change state policy to say aquifers are actually green and natural infrastructure. Just like we treat any other environmental asset, we have to treat aquifers in the same way. And aquifer replenishment then becomes a public benefit and would make it eligible for public funding. So in the white paper, we also lay out 8 major categories of factors that you have to consider when you're thinking about doing a flood-mar project, with a number of considerations. And we also lay out what people are identifying as barriers or challenges for doing flood-mar projects. And on this slide, I've just grouped them by those that deal with governance and the institutional issues, the legal water rights regulations permitting, the policy, like what is a public benefit. The other thing I'll note is I have reviewed a draft of the proposal that Eric laid out for you, Eric Ekdahl, and one of the things that I really appreciated is there's been this public debate of is recharge a public benefit? Well, in there, they clearly are laying out that there are in situ benefits from recharge and identify those as seawater repulsion, as reducing subsidence and improving water quality. So I think we're making advances in getting the public dialogue around what are public benefits and beneficial uses, and then the policy around landowner compensation and incentives, and then a whole host of implementation guidance for helping people work through the planning and implementation of projects. So far, the Department of Water Resources, again, primarily using our system re-op funding. We just got a little bit of funding out of Prop 68 for flood-mar. And if Prop 3 gets approved by the voters, there's another $10 million identified for flood-mar activities. So one of the neat things that I've experienced is this is one of the few initiatives that the more I talk about it with folks, the more enthusiasm and support I hear. In fact, we've heard legislative staff from the Central Coast ask us, how can we help you? So I think there's a lot of appreciation for this type of work. And I think having lived through a 5-year drought followed by the second wettest year on record, where people are watching the water go by when we've just gone through a 5-year drought, really hit home the need for this kind of a strategy. The other handout is a draft research and data development framework. So we kind of said, okay, the white paper's great, but there's these challenges and these benefits that, again, there's lots of data gaps, information gaps. So let's start a process where we engage the smart people who are knowledgeable about these various areas and put a research, an R&D plan together so that we can jointly go forward and invest in filling those data and information gaps so we can speak from a more informed position. The other thing we're doing with the funding we have so far is we're doing a Merced River Basin conceptual study. I have a slide just to tell you what we're doing there, and a Tuolumne River climate vulnerability study. So I mentioned the funding that we have and the kind of technical assistance and coordination work that we're doing. The research and data development framework, what we're hoping comes out of that is actually get our arms around what's the body of knowledge about flood-mar. what we've been seeing is a lot of people have been doing this work, but haven't been sharing the information. So we want to help in facilitating that. We want to develop an inventory and convene what we're calling a research advisory committee. I'll mention a little more on that. And really use this as a way to network the experts, bring the information together, and most importantly, get the information out to those who would implement flood-mar projects. So we've identified 13 categories or themes of research, and we're proposing the harebrained idea of setting up a subcommittee for each, and DWR staff is going to help staff that and bring experts from academia, from resource managers, from NGOs, whoever wants to participate on these various topics, and in the next year, year and a half, put a R&D plan together that would really lay out in clear terms what are the high priority pilot projects, what are the high priority research that could put farmers at ease that doing this isn't going to hurt their bottom line, to put regulators at ease that we're not going to be damaging the environment, and so on and so forth. The Merced River Flood Mar study is really trying to do an end-to-end surface water, groundwater, even what's called the GRAT tool that Sustainable Conservation put together on how farmers would actually manage their water into the ground. We're going to look at existing operations and infrastructure, revised operations and infrastructure, and revised operations and expanded infrastructure, and really kind of put out the domain of possibilities. You've heard about climate change, but what we'd like to do is actually begin quantifying in much more specific terms what each of our major tributaries are going to look like in the future. So you've heard people say, well, you can't take another drop out of the stream during the high flow, but the reality is, with climate change, there's going to be a lot more water. It's going to be a flood risk. And so what we've got to figure out is how much that additional flow will be when, and figure out how flood-mar could help manage that. So how do you stay involved? We set up a listserv that you can sign up for. We've got a comment email address. We are doing various meetings, the Research Advisory Committee. We want to partner with others, you know, like we're doing with the Merced River folks. We'd like to partner with other water managers and other tributaries to do pilot projects. And ultimately, we want to work to help people develop their projects. In the next 2 years, the GSAs have to submit their sustainability plans. What we would like is to have each and every one consider and include flood-mar projects as part of their portfolio of actions. And what we've tried to do is identify that there are really something for everyone in this: the landowners, the academia, NGOs and stakeholders, government agencies, regulators, and policy and decision makers. So the tail end of Eric's discussion with you, it was like, this would be at the level of the State Water Project. This is that or bigger. And so we have got to think of it that way. This is not just about one farm taking on some high flows. This is about replumbing the way California needs to manage its water. And so we've got our work cut out for us. We're going to continue to talk about the white paper and the R&D. We're going to convene the Research Advisory Committee in the next couple of months. We're already identified a state co-chair for each of those subcommittees. We've identified most of the non-state co-chairs. They together will make up the advisory committee, and we're going to use that brain trust to really help set the path. We're going to continue these pilot projects and share that information with folks, and then again get the GSAs and others to put this in their plans. That rocket this is a moonshot for California. Make no mistake, this is not easy. There's going to be a lot of work to be done, but this is not voluntary. This is what we got to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille. Really appreciate your enthusiasm, too. Okay, we'll open it up for any questions that we have.
So,
Matt?
go ahead.
I just want to thank Kamyar. I mean, it's just, I remember when you were presenting, I know you've been working on this for a long time, a lot longer than just the last year, but it just feels like it's gotten a lot more attention and traction because of all the groundwork you've done, and you are such a fabulous ambassador for it. I just think it's a very exciting vision, and I think it's great that we're actually able to start making some movement on it, and I have to agree. I mean, really, California has to do this. I mean, we have to do it. So the way you're organizing it to get all these folks together now to really think it through, I just think is really smart and right on, so.
Well, I think my question dovetails onto Ashley's comment. I mean, I've been sitting here for a while as on this board and hearing from various different proposals. And I think when we look at Australia in terms of their decades-long drought, in terms of the action they had to take at a national level, are we getting more and more to that point in California where we're going to have to take drastic action that's going to go above and beyond our normal processes that we've been doing? I mean, you see, just as Director Nemeth was mentioning, there's the renegotiation going on now with the Bureau and the State Water Project. I mean, are we getting to a point where it's becoming more and more likely that there's going to be some monumental shift in how we're doing things, and it's not going to be following the rules and regulations that we have in place? I mean, both of you have been in agencies for a while and kind of realized, and just, what's your perspective on that?
And then I'd like to comment too, and as another agency.
So I actually think the outcome of FloodMAR and FloodMAR type initiatives is as transformative as you're describing it. Because to do this, we are going to have to revisit the way our water sectors work together, our institutional, our local water entities work together, how state government and local efforts work together, and our regulations. We're going to have to revisit how we do things. And it's not weakening regulations. Again, the reality is we've got all these regulations, but our ecosystems are degraded. And so what we've got to do is find out how can we have a system-wide approach to help those environmental assets. I think SGMA will help us in a big way, because as long as our water cycle was disconnected, it's like we had this unseen slush fund, and it's hard to manage the system that way. I think we're now poised to go there, but it's going to it took us 100 years to get to where we're at, the problems. I don't think it has to take us 100 years to improve, but it will take a few decades. But we've got to begin that process soon.
I want to hear Eric's comments on water rights before I say anything.
I think it's on. Okay. Are we to a point where we need to fundamentally, transformatively change water rights? Not yet.
I was going to make
Right. What we saw, it's a fascinating question, and we've been asked it before. Do we do some sort of Australian-like approach where we fundamentally go back to the drawing board and take everything over and reallocate it? No, not yet. But you look 20, 40, 50 years down the road, if we don't do these things, if we don't look at FloodMAR, Camille highlighted some of the numbers, and it's potentially millions of acre-feet. Well, the entire overdraft in the Central Valley, or at least the Sacramento and maybe the San Joaquin, is about 1 to 2 million acre-feet. And that kind of balances it out right there. If you can put the infrastructure in place, if you can put the protocols in place, I think we're capable of doing that. And if we do these things, there's room for agriculture, there's room for municipalities, there's room for environmental flows, but we have to look at it in a comprehensive system.
So I was going to say, I can't see California even being close unless we have a total crisis by not using all the tools that we now know that we have, of doing what has happened in other countries, thinking of Israel and Australia simplified everything by just going to centralize, this is how we're going to do water. I can't see that happening here, but I do think, going back to Carla's comments this morning about this bigger picture of the connectedness, the integrated approach that we're taking, that we are seeing the possibilities that can come from that, but I cannot stress enough how much more collaboration is needed, and I'm sorry the other dean isn't here, from our scientific community needs to be a part of this collaboration, because the dueling headline approach to some of these issues is not helping. But the partnerships that are possible and that have already started are going to be a part of this. And I would say, and I've said this several times today, our understanding of the land-water connectivity and the work that has been done there, I think will continue to make change happen. And climate change and taking our approach that we are to natural working landscapes is very key to helping people take a more integrated, cooperative, collaborative approach on all of this. So I wish you all the best as I ride into the sunset.
Cam Yar, thank you for referencing our president, Don Corleone Cameron, and his role in this. You know, I do appreciate that. Do the cities have a role in this as well? I read a book recommended by Brock Dolman, how every kind of sidewalk and gutter right now is set to go out to flood flood channels or drainage channels, and if every so many feet they were punched into groundwater recharge areas, what better place to start with for the urbans than their own flood waters that are being channeled right off to other areas. But the massive amount of water is out in the rural, and love having Don Corleone head that up for us.
Yeah, this Kamyar. I mentioned it in context that stormwater management is really the urban complement to floodmar. And it actually has been occurring for a number of years, and what's been driving that is the water quality and the drainage issues. And now people are appreciating that the water that they were trying to get rid of is a resource that they need to bank and utilize. And so through what's called low-impact development, swales, pervious pavement, using groundwater catchment basins, the cities are beginning to appreciate that the runoff is an asset that they should hang on to. Floodmar, I don't think we're as far in the appreciation on the working lands. And like you mentioned, the volumes that we can handle are larger in part because of the pervious nature of our lands. And one of the things, the take-home messages for California should be, as we develop our urban sector, let's make sure we don't pave over the prime infiltration and working lands that are so essential in recharging our groundwater basins.
And on that, we've already recognized the climate benefit of preserving farmland through the Strategic Growth Council, and so for the last 2 years now, we've had $40 million for easements. And we are getting to a point in our climate discussions of recognizing the co-benefits that come from what was primarily reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, piece of that. But this becomes a very important piece to lay the maps over the lands that are coming to the Strategic Growth Council for conservation easements to perhaps add additional points, potentially. I can't speak for the Strategic Growth Council, really looking at the water element of this to see what other co-benefits could be recognized in that. Yeah.
This has great potential, and Eric talked about the 1 million to 2 million acre feet. But one of the realities is most of the water's in the North State, and much of the overdraft is south of the Delta. So how much of the need in the San Joaquin Valley do you believe can be met by those flows that are strictly in the San Joaquin Valley? I have no clue on this, and I assume somebody's done some work on this, but, and I know we have to start small, and this has potential, but, you know, and granted, year in and year out, the weather's does vary, but if 15 growers in Don's area start doing this, would there be enough water? I mean, what type of size can we scale up to without then starting to worry about where else are we going to source the water?
So that's a great question, and I hope that the R&D framework will help us have a much more quantitative response. What I do know, again, the work that the HEC, the Hydrologic Engineering Center, did, just based on reservoir rule curve operations, they come up with 400,000 to 500,000 acre feet in south of the delta would, on average, would be available to bank into the ground. That was just reoperating the reservoirs. It wasn't catching flood flows and other parts of floodmar.
And what's the current overdraft in San Joaquin, annual basis? 1.8?
Well, yeah, that, and even that is a big, it's a wag. I mean, we don't really know. And so that's part of this, is we've got to get better information so that we can speak from a position of being informed. And we have the knowledge. It's just we've been working in our little fiefdoms, and what we'd like to do is use this initiative to connect the dots and really get people to appreciate that having a joint work plan where everyone is bringing their dollars to bear toward a common direction will get us further faster.
Coming from San Diego, I just want to emphasize that we are also related to our oceans, and that is the reason primarily that, besides the fact that we've only had 3 inches of rain this year, we need to be harvesting the runoff and cleaning it and reusing it, which is San Diego is taking a real role in doing that in the urban setting.
Yeah, thank you. This is fantastic. I had one clarifying question and then a couple of additional, but this chart right here sort of tells it all about, what's this is the one you started to start. What's the geography covered by? Is this the state of California?
No, I believe that's the American River. That's
Okay.
just the American
So it's
River I mean, the simulation was done on a broader, Central Valley, but that's just the American River
Okay.
results.
But presumably you could aggregate
Yes.
several big rivers and
Yeah,
it might
and you
tell
see the
story.
same pattern in
Pattern.
other river systems.
Yeah, that's really powerful, so thanks. A comment, so my organization, Environmental Defense Fund, helped initiate this competition on the lower Mississippi called Changing Course. And it's very similar to the challenge that we're facing in California, which is the Mississippi infrastructure for flood control and transport and whatnot needs to be, kind of rethought. And so the question was, well, how do you do that? And sometimes we're limited by the scope of what's in front of our face. And so they initiated a design competition and put it out there to engineering and architectural and creative firms to just come up with the wildest ideas that they could come up with to think about how you would do that big change. And I just recommend that to anybody to take a look at it. The program was called Changing Course, and some of the ideas are now being implemented. And they actually, there's some funding available in that part of the world, to some degree available because of the oil spill in the Gulf, that's being used to do some of that replumbing. But it's a great way of sort of thinking about sort of beyond the horizon in the way that you're talking about. I really appreciate that. I just had, my last question was about the research and development framework. Sort of how did you come up with this comprehensive list of questions? And is there any structure in place now to sort of make sure there's, well, you talked about subcommittees and whatnot, but is this really just sort of a shot in hope the funding comes through and that the research comes through, or do you have ideas about how to answer some of these questions?
Sure. The draft you have before you was developed as we put the white paper together. So as we began collecting the different resources and references of work that had been done and people identifying the challenges, we categorized and grouped them into this research and data development framework. So we see them as companion documents. One, the white paper kind of frames what we're trying to do, and the research and data development is what do we need to do to get more and better information. The framework is not the R&D plan. The framework is just framing the work plan. And what we're now doing through the end of September, we're asking for public comment, and we put this out a month and a half ago on this framework. When we convene the 13 subcommittees, what we're going to do is give them the framework, the public comments, and ask them to update the framework as their roadmap for developing the work plan. And then a year or so after that, we will work with them to develop the R&D plan that would identify specific activities, how much would it cost, and who would be positioned to do that work. And then the job starts of us going and using existing funding. Academics can apply for grant funding. We can, through the state government, request additional budgets to be able to do what. So this is just the beginning of that process.
A follow-up question to Eric. You mentioned that on just the outline here, some of the stakeholder groups you've been talking to, so you're expecting input from them by the end of this month, and I know my staff's already met with you at least once. And then that will start the drafting of the guidance document? And will the guidance document also go through public comment period, and what's the timing on preparing a guidance document since the Water Board has nothing else to do this year? Because you're using this process. Okay.
But that being said, it's still open for any comment, and we want to continue as much dialogue as we can. So as we start putting things out, and maybe we'll do one big guidance document, maybe it will be a couple of modules. We're not quite sure yet how we're going to roll this out onto the street. But one of the overwhelming things that we've heard so far is 90th percentile is too conservative, and we want to work with that. We want to be able to watershed, it's 80. Maybe in this watershed, it's 95. There's still a lot of potential opportunity for working with collaborators and interested parties going forward.
Well, thank you so much. This just seems so uplifting and encouraging. Of course, being conservative, I wonder, what are the hurdles that you foresee?
I think one of the biggest one is we need to keep communicating and coordinating, and that's one of the things that DWR is committed to do. We don't have all the answers, but we think we can help facilitate bringing the experts together through not a long drawn-out process. In a year and a half, we want to actually have a better handle of what knowledge we know and what we need to fill. And really, to me, it's really the beginning of practicing what we would mean by integrated water management. I mean, we talk about that as a concept. To me, Floodmar actually doing it is practicing integrated water management. And by doing it, we're just going to better improve our partnerships, our coordination, and some of those root causes that have made it difficult to make better advances are going to improve.
So it has the potential, on top of everything else, of being a proof of concept.
Absolutely. I think it'll be an example of the way we need to approach California water management and maybe resource management in general in California.
To Don's question before about how much water might be available to recharge, I just wanted to point folks or remind them of the report that the Public Policy Institute of California put out last spring, specifically for the San Joaquin Valley. So it's not the whole state, but Their estimate was that recharge in all its forms could account for about a quarter of the average annual overdraft on an annual basis. So it obviously doesn't solve the problem, but it's a very important tool in the toolbox. That you have to also take into account, not only is more water in Sac Valley than San Joaquin Valley, more water is in the northern San Joaquin Valley than the southern San Joaquin Valley. So you still have significant conveyance issues.
Great, thank you both. Really appreciate all you've done for us, and keep up the good work. And really, thank you for, I know I gave you a bad time about simplifying the process. But I do understand it's complicated and time-consuming, and you've got to have a lot of patience to get through anything that has to do with water. So that's what I've learned over the last 7 years or more. Anyway, thank you again. All right. We have before us the letter, the staff letter,
Potential, only if it
potential staff letter. Go ahead, Don.
I just want to thank Kumiar's other staff people who are there. I know they've worked on this, but they've worked on a lot of other projects for a long time. They were very familiar faces to me. They spent a lot of time in Northern California, but thank you all for continuing to engage.
Yep. And Don said he was going to send some of his water south. All right, Josh, did you?
Based on the board's interest and past action on water issues, staff kind of developed this letter for your consideration, and I included it on the agenda with the board president's endorsement in regards to the water quality control plan for the San Francisco, Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta in regards to actions taken by the state board. Comment period is closed. This could be a letter to the governor or other members of the administration in regards to that issue, kind of following up on some of the positions the board has taken in the past.
And it could also just be reaffirming some of the things we heard today as well. We just wanted to make sure you could take action today and not wait another month to do a letter.
What I like about this letter is it's objective. We don't get into any arguments about what the science is. I mean, there are some very significant issues that the state board needs to address. I think this calls those out. Be it the reasonable beneficial use of the water, not only for the environment, but for ag and urban areas. And obviously, you heard the discussion today about the potential impact in the rural communities, and so, it needs to be addressed. And then, there have been some assumptions on the use of sustainable groundwater. Surface water is going to disappear, and you just go pump groundwater. Well, that needs to be part of the model and looked at long term. And if you happen to have a drought in the second and third year, again, what happens? And that's not looked at. And then the climate change issue is huge. So I don't think this is doing anything more than reaffirming what they should be looking at. And lastly, before you start, it emphasizes the voluntary settlement agreements, which really are the most important piece of this, because if we can get there, the state's gonna be in a much better place.
So that actually is what I was going to say, was that, why I agree with much of what's in the letter. My understanding is the comment period is closed. So the time for those comments to be made would have been back when the comment period was open. I'm not sure what mileage we gain from doing that. But I do think the voluntary settlement piece is the most important piece. And so a letter not only encouraging the state board, but also all the agencies that are needed to make that happen, I think would be where to emphasize.
I do want to go back. They closed the record rather surprisingly very quickly. So I don't think a letter to the state board is even appropriate. This is your usual role in how you often do, sending a letter of thanks or recommendations to the governor.
Do we have any other discussion on the letter?
I guess, then maybe I would just say that if we want to keep these points in about Sigma and climate change, I think maybe if we could craft it in a way that,
But it supports the voluntary settlement.
yeah, that says that these are very important issues and makes the importance of the voluntary settlements even more vital. And so to really put the attention there, I think that would be a little more targeted.
Go ahead, Don.
I think it's twofold to me. One is, this is a letter to the governor's office, most likely, that really expresses ag serious concerns about what's going on, okay? So, and I think it's very important that the particular points be spelled out. Secondly, there is a large ag community that needs to understand that we're aware of these issues and we support their concerns. I think it needs to stay more closely to where it is, because I think we have to give reassurance to those in ag that aren't here, that yes, we share your concerns.
Okay, do we have any other comments? Yep, Nancy?
I'm an English major, and I just want to say I really appreciate the well-crafted language.
Thank you, Josh. Any other comments?
Do you need a motion for this from the board or?
Sorry, one more suggestion. I do like the idea of including some of what we heard today, particularly about the integration, and that certainly supports the Sigma part of the letter.
I like the idea. I think it's great that we send this to Governor Brown. And if you're looking for a motion, I would move that we support this. I do think there's room for hopefully if Ashley or Josh or Dawn were to still want to make amends, but I support this concept and the intent and the content. And
Okay,
so I'll move it.
Do we have a second? Second? We'll open it up for discussion. Any other discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? So moved. Okay, we'll move on to public comment. Here we go. Somebody made it to the end.
The most patient person.
You know what? That is such a compliment, because I used to be one of the most radical of the radicals. So it's really good to be here. I really came for signatures, you know. Thank you. No, it's really exciting to hear. You know, certainly the importance of urban agriculture, because it was like fighting. I mean, really tooth and nail to get anything at the federal level to even be able to start counting our farmers in the urban service boundary. It just didn't make sense. So this Saturday, some of y'all know about a muscadine grape from the South? So it's like opening weekend for the California-grown muscadines. We got them all over urban, South Sacramento, South Stockton, and it's muscadine grown in the South. You know, from my father's folks in Louisiana and my mother's folks, and we're coming up with our own unique cultivar, trying to play with the muscadine in backyards and front yards throughout the Central Valley. It's kind of interesting. And then so the end of the month is the California Pan-Africa Global Trade Investment Conference. So some of the very well-heeled folks in Africa that own platinum mines, diamond mines, and have some tea factories on the surface. We're trying to encourage them to come back and do some things. So it's kind of interesting. That's in LA on the 27th, 28th, the Pan-African Global Trade and Investment Conference. And it's been down there for 8 years. Next year it's going to be in Sacramento. And that was like pulling teeth, but I just said, just close your eyes and imagine, you know, limousines with Africans jumping out of limousines, you know, with dignitaries. Folks have never seen that here. Some of us have been to DC and LA, and it's something to see, you know, dripped in gold and, you know, with plenty of money. So I encourage you to look for that in LA. I'll send some information to you. And then if you hadn't got your copy, there's one floating around somewhere. I need it back because it's going someplace else. But yes, it was kind of special because it was my mother's 75th birthday, and she was talking to some. I was supposed to get it earlier because you haven't met my mother yet. But I was like, yeah, she's a black woman with a black belt, you know. I'll get you the autograph. So anyway, it's always a blessing and a pleasure to be here because I've been on this trail a long time just to make sure blacks in agriculture have a place in California. And now it's like beyond my expectations, so I'm smiling a lot.
So, Michael, you'll be glad to know legislation passed last year, and we started our interview process early so that we're bringing on our first ever farmer equity officer the middle part of September, and their focus is to make sure that all of our programs and USDA programs and other programs throughout government are well-known and made available to farmers from disadvantaged communities and minority farmers and anyone else who has felt underserved up until now. So we're very excited about that person coming on board later this month.
Yes. I don't know how long you're going to stay, but I hope they get to meet you and hear how.
I'm going to be here to the end of the year. Carla, I voted that I'll be the one to turn off the lights before the
Love to hear it. Thanks.
Don?
I just want to tell the people on this side of the room we're all admiring. Helene was featured on the cover of Edible Sacramento.
Edible and delicious.
Yeah, I would like to get an autographed copy. I just have one public comment, which is it's just to make you all aware that a bill called AB 2421 passed the Assembly last week, and it's on the governor's desk. It's to create a new program at the Wildlife Conservation Board called the Monarch and Pollinator Conservation Program. And I was so impressed that we've broken $50 billion as an agricultural industry, and I don't know exactly the proportion that's pollinator dependent, but it's not insignificant. And this is probably the place on earth where pollinator-dependent agriculture is most valuable. So it's a small program right now, and frankly, the Wildlife Conservation Board could use all the advice it could get from farmers about how to make the program practical and attractive to farmers.
And of course, we've already done our enrolled bill report, so you can guess what position we're advising. But that does include a consultative role for CDFA to make sure that there's private landowner, farmer input into their programs going forward. So that was a good thing to add that consultative role for
Absolutely.
us.
So, Monarch are sort of the signature invertebrate on this program. They're unfortunately not a very good pollinator, so they're not going to add much value, but they are iconic. And they're actually there's a fairly significant tourism industry based around their overwintering on the coast. So, but I'll just say real quickly that WCB, a fantastic sort of partner organization within state government here, they sort of default to wanting conservation projects to be very long in duration, and that's really critical for a lot of conservation programs that they manage. This is one where the urgency to conserve breeding habitat for monarch and overwintering habitat is so great that it may be not the best instinct to require long-term contracts. It may be better to get farmers and ranchers into the program with shorter-term contracts and get them moving. Mr. Cameron is doing some pollinator conservation right now, and we've got some, we're gonna, but he can testify the fact that this is gonna require adaptive management, and what works the first year may not work what didn't work the first year may work, you may figure it out and do better the next year. So anyhow, it's just, it's a really cool program. Secretary Ross was incredibly supportive, and I appreciate all the work. It was also put into the budget at $3 million, so it's the money's there, it's been signed into law. This is the authorizing legislation that sort of describes the parameters of the program and the type of administration, so thank you.
No, it's a great program, and we learned a lot this year, that we found that it grew great in the fields. We had a tough time, we had a lot of weed issues. We're gonna figure that out and probably move forward with it next year. Yes,
Finally, September 8th, there's going to be across the state many public rallies and events supporting the climate initiatives that the governor's put in place and more. And I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to turn out and let the rest of the United States and the rest of the world know that California is the most aggressive climate change leader we have right now.
thank you, Nancy. Any other business? If not, we're adjourned. Thanks for coming. Good to see everybody
I'm sorry,
this meeting.
before, I just want to, I saw, I don't, Jack, have you been there the whole time?
Yes, he has been.
Okay, so anyways, Jack Rice from the Farm Bureau was, and Noel Kremers and the whole Farm Bureau were really supportive of AB 2421, so
That's good.
Great.
I just noticed he was there, so,
Jack.